Hi. Let's hope we live up to our bios. So I wanted to open the evening by saying how excited I was when Dr. Zarum, Rabbi Zarum, reached out to me and asked me to interview him for his new book. I was excited on many levels for many reasons. Number one, because I love the CSP community. And obviously, I was very, very happy to once again see all your lovely faces. And also because I was incredibly excited about Rabbi Zarum's book. And I'll just go back a few years. Rafi, and I'll hope it's okay that we'll call each other by
Please.
first name terms, was one of my first teachers, really outside of the school education system. And believe me, my school education system wasn't anything to go by. So I was in desperate need of some wonderful education. And I really got that when I went to LSJS. And I used to learn every week. I used to go and listen to Rabbi, he was at the time Dr. Zarum, still Dr. Zarum, now Rabbi Dr. Zarum. And I absolutely loved his classes. And it wasn't just the content, which in and of itself was fantastic, as I'm sure you all know, but it was the way he used to get me to think, which really I had never been challenged. And I was a teenager, and then in my later teens and my early 20s, and I used to look forward every week to going and learning with Rafi, because my brain would ache by the end of it, and it felt as if something had expanded, and you just felt as if you were a little bit closer to the Torah, to its warmth and its truth after you walked out of Rafi's classes. So, and then as time went on, I began to help our mutual friend Mark Weinberg, Zichrono Livracha, who was extremely instrumental in getting LSJS back on its feet with the ELO program. And we started working kind of closely together on things like that. And of late, very recently, we were together. We've been together over the last year. Rafi's obviously been very involved with the SAC scholars, and I've been a SAC scholar. So we even went to a retreat last summer together, and we managed to have some conversations and some time, which we haven't really had for a long time. So I really couldn't be happier to be in conversation. And I'm super excited about his book, which I have to be honest, I love so much. I read it in one Shabbat. It was absolutely excellent. I couldn't put it down. Let's begin the evening. And I want to start by talking about the genre. Where we're going with this book. And we're going to do it. I'm going to be asking Rafi questions. He's going to be responding. I'm going to be, with Rafi's permission, I'm going to be interjecting here and there where I feel that, he needs to be pushed on something or doesn't need to be pushed on something. But I want to just go back a minute and talk about the idea of the book. We, as everyone knows, we are the people of the book. That's what the Jewish people are called. It's a term that a lot of people like to use. And obviously, when we talk about being the people of the book, we're talking about the Bible. We're talking about Tanach. And we are saying in many ways that the Tanach, that the Bible expresses these certain truths about Jews, about Judaism, about the world, about humanity, about human nature. And this truth about being the people of the book actually sits at the heart of the festival we're about to celebrate, of the Exodus story. That when we came out of Egypt, Moshe turned around to the people, and instead of, often I ask my kids, I say, what would you have expected Moshe to say to the people when they left Egypt? And my kids, as they know very well, when we're about to go on a journey, it doesn't even matter if it's 10 minutes down the road. How long is it going to take? Have you got food? How long does it take till we get there? What's our ETA? What are we going to do when we get there? So we would kind of expect that to be Moshe's message to the people. The plan, what we're going to do, how we're going to get there. And instead, what we see is that he actually again and again speaks to the people about questioning. When your children ask you, when your son questions you, this is what you shall say. And we hear that statement again and again, because it's clear that in order to become a free people, the Israelites need to learn curiosity. They need to learn how to think freely, how to question. For liberty to happen, it doesn't just happen physically in our body, it happens in our minds. And that has been the Jewish mission ever since. We are the people of the book, not just because we brought the Bible to the world, but also because the essence of learning of the book is what we are all about. Our creativity, our intellectual heritage, that's the mark of a free people. That is the mark that we brought. That is the beauty that we brought to this world. And I think Rafi's book adds to that rich tradition, to that rich oral tradition that we have, because its very basis, its very thesis is based on asking. It's asking the big questions. It's asking us to question our central assumptions sometimes. And then for people who are questioning, he brings very different ways of looking at certain things that perhaps in the past we didn't think about. It always reminds me of what Elie Wiesel famously said. He says, answers close us off, but questions make us grow. They open us up. There is a quest in a question. And Rabbi Zarum begins the book by saying, I'm not going to offer you so many answers. I'm going to offer you responses, which I think is such a beautiful way of approaching questions that sometimes we don't always have a set boxed answer, because a response allows me to grow. It allows me to keep question open. So I want to begin by asking you, Rafi, what were the origins of the book? How did you, we know that for those of you that haven't got the book is actually got in and of itself, it questions, I'm just looking here at the opening, it's set into three different, structured into three different parts. Part one is the origins, part two is ethics, and part three is beliefs. Can you talk us through what the origins of the book were, why you chose to structure it in this way, and if there's particular significance to the topics that you chose?
Sure. Thank you, Tanya. And it's great to be here with you. So glad you're Dr. Tanya White and you're doing this, and you're growing as an educator. It makes me very, very happy. I'll tell you about the book. I'll tell you why I did it. It's because people have been asking me questions for years, difficult questions that, if I'm honest, challenge me as well. And I remember very clearly we had a conference for primary school Jewish studies teachers. So you have to imagine at the college, we had 200 of them from all over the UK, and they come together once a year for a conference about being better teachers, about pedagogy, different ideas. And I did a session on difficult questions, responding to difficult questions that your children ask. Because I thought it'd be interesting to know what happened. And normally there's about 5 classes at each time, so you get about 30 or 40 in a class. I had about 90 people show up to my class, and they were like edgy, these teachers. It's like they want to get something off their chest. And I said, so what are the questions the children ask you? Remember, this is elementary school, so these are like, from 5 to 10, 11-year-olds. And they just gave a barrage of questions on everything. On one person said, a 9-year-old said, why does everybody not like Israel? And this is 10 years ago. This is not recently, post October the 7th. This is a question they've always noticed, people. What one rabbi said to me, he said, I was giving a class and a child said to me, Rabbi, I don't need to listen to you because I'm an atheist. 10-year-old boy, I'm an atheist. All right. So the rabbi said to me, he goes, how do you respond to a boy who says in your class, I don't have to listen to you, I'm an atheist. So I said, well, never forget that you're an educator. And the first thing you say is spell atheist. Okay, he's 10 years old. How's his spelling? And I realized from these questions, hundreds of them, that even at a young age, children are asking really difficult, challenging questions. And sometimes when they become teenagers, they get a bit less confident about asking. I was sitting with 3 or 4 years ago, a guy in shul turned to me during the week of Parshat Noach about the flood, and he leaned over in the middle of laning. This guy comes to shul every day, and he says, you don't really think this happened, do you? With a big grin on his face. So I said, oh, I'll talk to you later. But we ask these fundamental questions, and I've always imagined that, because I always researched them for myself. This fascinated me ever since I was a child, my scientific interest. But I asked if other people had them, or if they believed in God. And you'd be surprised how many people who go to shul, and I mean Orthodox shuls as well, progressive as well, who aren't sure about God, but they like the songs, they think there's something there. And so I wanted to kind of address those issues, I think, because we sometimes feel it's not okay to ask them. So I wanted to make it more okay. So I've had hundreds of questions, and I decided to choose 12, which had real resonance that I could really get my teeth into. So as you said, the first third is about origins. These are the kind of origin questions of the world and of the Jewish people. So why are there 7 days of creation when it's 40.5 billion years? 30.5 billion years. And my scientific background means I really like dealing with those. Now, they've been dealt with before, but I tried to do it in an interesting way. So the second chapter is about Darwin and evolution. Because again, that's a great question. You've got every day of creation, God makes different things, and yet Darwin says clearly one evolves to the other. And I studied evolution for many years to understand it. I remember when I was in yeshiva, one rabbi said to me, he said, when it comes to evolution, I've got one thing to say. He said, anybody who thinks they descended from apes probably did. And I was like, so I laughed. And then I said, is that your answer? He goes, yeah. I said, is that it? He goes, that's it. And I was like, that's not good enough. Like, it's a clever quip, and people do those quips the whole time. And rabbis or teachers think this quip answers the question. It doesn't. And it leaves the person away thinking they don't really know, they don't really value it, it's not important. And that's not good enough for me. So my chapter on Darwin, and again, I wanted to try and make it an interesting approach, was about Darwin's life and Darwin's questions and Darwin's doubts. He was going to be a priest until he ended up on the Beagle and did a different direction. And he began to question God, not because of evolution, but because one child died in childbirth, one of his children, and the second one died as a teenager. That made him very upset. So as he got older, his wife was very frum, his wife very religious, and he would walk her to church each week. But then he would stay in the gardens and walk outside. He wouldn't go into church. It's what I call doing security, like stand outside. So that chapter about Darwin is, again, what does evolution mean for the Torah? Then the next one's about the flood. Does the flood story really happen? Is it true? And what's it there to teach us? And the fourth one, very relevant to now, did the Exodus happen? Right? Even though I believe it happened as a historical event, it's very hard to prove in any level, in any way whatsoever, that it happened. So how do we deal with that as modern people who want, on one hand, to respect historicity and truth and history, and on the other hand, believers, we grew up with Pesach. I begin the chapter saying, if the Exodus didn't happen, we really are in trouble. So that's what that section, that's about origins. That's the kind of physical world that we live in and how that relates to Torah. The middle level are the ethical questions, and there's lots of them. Why does the Torah allow slavery? Right, just a few weeks after coming out of Egypt, where we'd been slaves, the Torah tells us not slavery is horrific, but yeah, you can have slaves. You can have slaves for you, and you can control them and punish them. Why does the Torah allow that? Why does the Torah allow eating meat, which we now know is so bad for us and for our environment? Why does it allow collective punishment, a very relevant issue for Israel today? Why does God willing to destroy the whole of a city of Sodom and Gomorrah if they're not all evil? Shouldn't one person be punished for what they do? And the final one of that section is about the chosen people. Isn't it elitist and inappropriate to be the chosen people if 0.001% of the world is Jewish and yet we think we're better than everybody else? It's a dangerous approach to have. So what's that about? And the last section then is about God. It's about what it means to have faith. So I don't try and prove God's existence. I think that's a foolish thing to do, and I explain that. But I discuss, what does it mean to believe in God? Well, what is that relationship? And then does that mean how come we can argue with God? There's lots of arguments that go on. I know that's an issue, Tanya, that you write and think a lot about in your philosophy and your teaching. And then this was all to get to a question that I really wanted to do, which is a lot of people feel that they're not religious, spiritual. They don't feel spiritual connection, but they still feel a deep connection to the Jewish people. So is that Jewish? Is that in the sources as well? And I try and argue that it is. That being part of the Jewish people, even if you're not religious and have questions about God, is fundamental, and you're definitely part of the Jewish people. And it's a very important chapter about that. And then finally, why pray? Because I think that's a challenge that we have today as moderns. We don't feel the need to pray in lots of ways. So the book is structured in that way. And I did it. People said to me, why don't you start with God? Surely God, you start with God, then afterwards you do ethics, and then you might do things in the world. And just for me, naturally, as a scientist, I wanted to start with the physical world, and then I get to more complex ideas of morals, and then ultimately the spirit of God. That was just what was in my head. But a couple of months ago, I don't know if I told you this yet, I was putting my tefillin on, and then I got the answer of why the book was structured in this way. So when you put tefillin, when a person puts tefillin on, you wrap around your finger, and you say this verse from chapter 2 of Hosea, which says, may I be bound to you, forever. Let me be bound to you with righteousness and justice. And let me bound to you with faith and knowing God. And I realized those three are the three parts of my book in that order. So the first one, now the word olam, I'm a scientist, so I love this translation, but olam can mean le'olam va'ed, forever and ever. It means the olam, the world. So it's basically space-time, which is what us physicists call reality, space-time. That's what that means. So I'm bound to you in space-time. So in which case, how does space-time work? How old is the universe? How does it all work? That's what the first section is. The second section, I'm bound to you in righteousness and justice. What does that mean to be right and just? That's the ethical principles in the second section of the book. And the last part is and I'm bound to you, be'emunah, with faith. V'yadat Hashem, and to know God. And that's what the last section's about. So I can't pretend that I was thinking of that, Tanya, when I did it, but had a big grin. I was like, yeah, I felt legitimized, as it were, because Ashia thought in that way as well. So I structured it in that way. And hopefully by the end of it, people are thinking in a very different way than when it began.
Wow, that's really, really beautiful. I absolutely love that. I love that whole chapter, that whole story of Hosea, where that comes from, which is really where God turns around to this prophet and says to him, I'm going to show you what it feels like to be cheated on. And he makes him marry a harlot, and then the harlot cheats on him. And in order to win the harlot back, he takes her to the desert, and he says to her, don't call me Ba'ali, call me Ishi, right? Don't call me your owner, your husband, your owner. Call me your partner. And this actually goes to...
My man, yeah.
No,
absolutely.
sorry, my man, sorry.
Yeah.
Ish and Isha, which is
it's so
basically.
modern.
It's so modern, but it goes back to what I love about your book, the third part of your book. One of my favorite chapters, which I want to get to a little bit later, is where you speak about the idea of emunah, what emunah is today. And I don't want to give it all away, because we want to leave people curious to pick the book up and read it, because obviously this is not enough. But Dr. Zarum brings such a beautiful idea of emunah in that chapter, and I think it's really, really poignant. So, Rafi, I'm going to ask you a fun fact question. Very often when you have at the end of a film, or you have at the end of a series, you have the takeouts, right? Which is the scenes that didn't quite make it into the book. So I wanted to ask you if there were any takeouts. Were there any things that you were thinking about that you didn't put in, that you would have put in, that maybe you left out for various reasons?
Well, I was going to write about Revelation, Revelation at Mount Sinai, but that's written about a lot, and Rabbi Dr. Sam Lieben's done a wonderful book on that subject. But for me, I don't know, Revelation leaves me cold in that way, and I'll tell you why. And I know we've got people who are listening here who are from all different denominations, and my approach, Tanya, might surprise you on this, which is that everybody believes in Revelation anyway. What do I mean? So, there's debate amongst the Orthodox and the Conservative Reform. Is it all written by God? Is it partly man? All that kind of stuff. But yeah, and I've said this, and I go to Linwood every year, as people know in England, where I meet rabbis of all different denominations, and I say to my friends, Reconstructionist rabbis and Reform, I say, do you take the Torah out the ark? And they say, yes. I say, do you kiss the Torah? And they say, yes. I said, do you make a bracha before you read from the scroll? They say, yes. And when you study it, do you see those verses more important than anything else? And they say, yes, of course. And so I say, why? Right? Because all these debates about Revelation are that you don't, and that it's just a book, and it was human, and it wasn't really. So we have the debate. But I'm actually quite a practical person, a pragmatist. I look at how do all Jews, we value this Torah as something really, really special. So the debate about Revelation is interesting, but it doesn't really affect, I think, belief in a way. That's why I didn't think it was so important. That was one I didn't do. The other one I didn't do is because I wanted this to be my first book, and as an Orthodox rabbi, not my last. And it's a very important subject, and that's two issues actually. The chapter title is that I didn't do is, why does the Torah privilege heterosexual men? In other words, why is it written from a straight male point of view? At Mount Sinai, when God says, prepare for 3 days, don't go near a woman, right? That's not written to the Jewish people. That's written to men, straight men, right? It's obvious that when you read the Torah, it's written from that point of view. And why would that be the case? And how limiting is it, right? 50% of the Jewish people is female, obviously, and 3 to 4% are not straight or LGBTQ and so on. How does the Torah work on these issues? And it's a challenging issue. I've got some interesting ideas. I've been discussing with different groups about them. I'm not fully convinced by my answers yet, Tanya. I've got some from the Rambam, which I'm not happy with. I don't think they're so compelling enough. And so that's another reason I didn't write it, because I didn't think I had anything good enough. In a previous book launch, I mentioned that I'd love to see women writers be writing on this subject as well. It shouldn't men. But then someone says to me, no, women should write, but men have to be allies and support. So I accept that as well. I want to write to support others, but I really want forefront women writers who are writing on this, because the female voice in terms of understanding Torah is key. But those are two chapters I didn't do. And then I mean, post October the 7th, I suppose, in terms, that's just thinking now in terms of our understanding of our relationship towards Israel, which is very complicated. It'll be interesting to write about. And maybe in the future, artificial intelligence. But I chose these 12 and I'm happy with them. But those are some of the things that got left on the cutting room floor in making the movie.
Well, there you go. That's your next book.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, thank you. So what I would love to invite you to maybe just read one small extract from the book for us all, perhaps from the introduction, so that people can have a bit of a taste, and then we'll go into some really more kind of focused questions that I want to ask you on a couple of the chapters. So
Great,
I invite
great.
you, Rafi, to
Okay, I'll
read.
do that now. Here's the book, by the way. And I know some people have had Jacqueline Nichols, my wife, talk. And she actually created the cover for me, which is it's a
Beautiful.
double-edged sword, by the way, because when you ask her off, if whatever she does, you have to say yes, obviously. But thank God it was really it was what I thought wasn't what I thought of at all. You can't really see it on the skin. It doesn't really give it
See.
away. But what she writes about it, she says that it's inspired by cloud formations that do not have a clear edge, yet have form and presence. Which I think is such a brilliant way of describing faith, right? You can see a cloud, you know it's there, but when you fly into it, it's ethereal. So it was a brilliant image to do. Anyway, so I'll read you from the
Beautiful.
just a couple of pages from the introduction. Here we go. Do you firmly believe in God? Do you think all the stories in the Torah are true? And are its laws still ethical for today? If you're not certain, then you're not alone. The modern world has dramatically changed us all. Scientific innovation and instant online access have increased our knowledge exponentially. Radical changes in social norms have profoundly affected our attitudes and values. New discoveries about human history, culture, and psychology force us to constantly reassess our sense of humanity and its purpose. Jews, of course, are not exempt. These changes have led many of us to ask deep and difficult questions about our faith. Some find the Torah to be antiquated and unscientific, with little to say on contemporary issues. Some query the morality of Jewish law when it clashes with modern sensibilities. Some search for an authentic relationship with God and wonder why they've never experienced it. Most worrying of all, some feel that Judaism lacks relevance and personal meaning in their lives. In my experience as both a lecturer and a rabbi, the questions being asked are rarely intended to provoke or belittle Judaism. On the contrary, they come from an honest desire to better appreciate our religious tradition. At times, when questions are expressed forcibly, they may come from feelings of frustration or even anger, but they tend to arise from a genuine desire to live a fulfilling Jewish life. Judaism was always meant to be a religion that encourages questions. It says in Deuteronomy, ask your father who will tell you, your elders who speak to you. From the inquisitive child at the Passover Seder to the confused yeshiva student who questions their teacher's lecture, Jewish tradition is suffused with a culture of curiosity. Abaye, the 4th century Babylonian sage, would often say, Ani patuch, I'm thinking in Hebrew, I'm open and ready to answer any questions people have on the Torah. And yet, I've spoken with many people who feel that their questions have been left unanswered. This might be because they found the responses unsatisfying, or simply because they never found anyone comfortable enough to ask. This can open the door to disillusionment and a gradual disengagement of Jewish life. A weak reply to a real question, or ignoring it completely, confirms the feelings in the questioner that Judaism is ill-equipped to respond to contemporary issues. Besides being insensitive, teachers who give flippant or dismissive answers fail to understand the religious angst of the sincere individual who stands before them. Receiving a pat answer can cause further problems. It shuts down rather than opening them up to further exploration, as you said. Answering a question with a quick and clever retort comes across well at the time, but crumbles when scrutinized. One of my teachers, Joshua Engelman, a good friend, was fond of saying, never ruin a first-rate question with a second-rate answer.
Mm.
So what do I know? Well, to be honest, I've been asking many of these questions myself for a very long time. I too was frustrated with many of the stock responses and formulations with which I was routinely presented. And so I went looking for something better. I sought out ideas, books, and people who might help me. Years of learning with some wonderful rabbis, pursuing academic studies, exploring my Yemenite Ashkenazi heritage, reading widely and teaching reflectively, and having endless late-night conversations have enabled me to forge a path. I believe serious questions should be treasured. They reveal a genuine interest. They show that the asker is trying to make sense of what they're learning and attempting to see how it fits into their view of the world. Inquiry is the springboard to further knowledge and new perspectives. There you go. That's the first page and a half.
Beautiful. Beautiful. It's really, I mean, it expresses so much that so many people, I think both believers and non-believers in many ways, and people all in the middle, the whole spectrum really will identify with. And I think, yeah, you read it beautifully as well. Someone just asked, will there be an audiobook? So hopefully that might be the next stage. I would like to now, you read a little bit from the introduction. I'd like to now actually question you about one of the questions in the first part of the book, which is the question of, is creation at odds with modern science?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to just read a few short extracts in order to kind of frame the question I'd like to ask you. You write, in sum, the account of the origin of the universe in Genesis was never meant to be a historical description or scientific treatise. Rather, it belongs in the realm of theology and philosophy, presenting us with profound ways to perceive and conceive the world and our existence. And then you talk about, is creation at odds with modern science? If we read it in a literal way, then yes. But if we read it in a more metaphorical way, perhaps not. And you expand on that. And I actually want to go back to your introduction where you talk about, hold on, our tradition. Where is it? 1 second. Okay, our tradition spans thousands of years and encompasses multiple different approaches, which are often subtle and complex. That's why I prefer the term responses. Responses are not universal. They are situated in place and time. They engage with the questioner. They encourage comebacks and further discussion. Okay, and then you talk about that's what you want to do in the book. You want to respond to the modern challenges. So I want to ask a question. Which prism do you view the argument in chapter 1? Do you see it as a response that's conditional to time conditional, or perhaps as more of a reason? Because you talk about different things. You talk about a response and you talk about reasonable arguments, that you also say the book presents reasonable arguments. So I just wonder whether this chapter 1, where you're talking about, or question 1, where you're talking about the idea of science, of creation and science, whether you see your argument as a reasonable argument, or you see it as a response, which is perhaps time conditional, and maybe we're responding really to the moment and seeing it in a metaphorical, not in a literal way, but maybe as science develops, we might be able to go backwards again. So I'm just wondering how you would frame this question.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, I'm a scientist by training, and all scientific responses are conditional. Right? We're always reviewing our understanding of reality. We have models, and they're always evolving. We have paradigm shifts every so often, where we look at it completely differently. So I really believe that in time, our attitudes are going to change to these things, and what is of a concern to us is going to change. So I've got no problem with saying that all my responses, when I gave this to, I mentioned Sam Liebman's earlier, the book, and I put, all my responses are conditional in time. He put in a note when he was giving me feedback. He goes, well, but maybe this one will last. This one will last forever. But I don't see it like that way, because we're always changing, and what is our key focus is not fundamental. It's interesting in science we have. So I think we're getting to the heart of what the nature of reality is, but I still believe we've got some paradigm shifts to come in the future of how we look at reality. It's interesting, if you look at the end of the 19th century, physicists were convinced that they'd solved all the major issues, and they were saying there's just a few concepts to mop up, and this is before quantum mechanics and relativity theory and chaos, which changed everything. So every time you think you're near the end of science, you realize you're actually the end of one view, and you're beginning furtively to enter a new kind of world. So I think in Torah as well, in terms of human relationships, we're just, I think, at the beginning. I think it was Heschel who said that we're just at the beginning of understanding what the Bible is really about, and there's a lot more to understand. So in that sense, I'm not just being humble. I really think the questions work for now, right? It's like there's a I always say, you know, and it's something that another teacher said to me. He said, if you're saying, he said, Josh Schrenger, we say this to me, he was my teacher. He said, if I'm teaching the same Torah this year as I taught last year, shoot me. It's interesting, right? He's always responding to the moment, to the time, and interpreting in different kind of ways. So to that extent, I do. So yes, I do make argument about the Torah, what the Torah is not. I'm much more sure what the Torah is not than what the Torah is. It's definitely not a history book or a science book. But
So
what is it? It's like
yeah.
theology and philosophy, but it's its own genre. It's like there's some very interesting books about the books of the past and the similarities, but the differences between ancient Mesopotamian writings and Egyptian writings, and then the Torah and then the Greeks. And it's just its own genre. It's just something different. And so therefore to understand it is going to be a long journey.
I find it, what I loved about this book, and I said this to you when we chatted, is that I really could feel in every part of it, definitely in the first part, obviously, but certainly even in the last part, I felt that your experience and your, I guess all your knowledge as a physicist and from a scientific background really came to bear in many of your answers and many of the examples and analogies and things that you bring. And specifically in the question that I asked you, I mean, clearly you take a more metaphorical reading of creation rather than a literal reading of creation, which you would expect, I guess, a scientist to try and, do what a lot of people do, which is to match together or to try and find ways to put the creation story within the Big Bang story and whatever. But you take it to a slightly different place. And it reminded me very much, and I think you may even mention Rabbi Sacks's left and right brain way of thinking in his book, The Great Partnership, where he speaks about science being left brain and religion being right brain, and how in some ways you can't translate between the two, and that being the case, it's you can't think about them in the same place. They work together side by side, but they're not meant to be merging. How much, I mean, I know obviously you're very well versed in Rabbi Sacks. How much was that paradigm, that way of looking at it? How much did that come into your thinking about this particular question?
I've always thought I've discussed that. I mean, he gave me that book to read. That was the one he asked because he knew I was a scientist.
Right.
I
I remember you
checking.
said, yeah.
But the approach I really like most is from Karen Armstrong. I don't know if you heard of it. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
She was a nun, and then she's a brilliant philosopher and writer. And she wrote
I've
a
read
response
some of her
actually to
stuff.
Dawkins' The God Delusion, actually, the case for God. But she
Yeah.
basically said, like Rabbi Sacks was upset about this whole fight between the atheists and the religious people and people taking sides. He wanted to move it on, and that's why he talks about this partnership, the two sides. But Karen Armstrong writes it brilliantly. She says, in the ancient world, no one ever confused logos and mythos. Like logos was logic and rational thinking, and mythos was more spiritual. And she gives a great example. She says, let's go back a few hundred years when you've got a clan living in a region, and they go out on the hunt for the day. And a whole bunch of men with the young boys go together to hunt down the wild boar, to kill it, to bring it back. And they kill it, and they bring it back, and they sacrifice, and they kill it, and the blood comes out, and they make food ready, and they also sacrifice to the gods. And she says, think what they're doing in that day. During the day, they know they can't just pray to the gods that they'll be successful. They've got to hold that spear at the right angle with the right wind velocity to chuck it in order to hit the boar. And they've got technique and technology and experience of doing it. And that's rational, logical thinking. And they know that's what they need to do to get the animal. And yet later, when they eat it and they burn some up and they thank the gods and they dance and they sway, they're not being rational then. They're being appreciative and thankful. And she said in the ancient world, it was natural, those two things. They didn't clash with each other. There was a place for both. Modern people have got weird thinking that actually only one of those two worlds makes sense. That I can just pray to God and everything will be all right, which is ridiculous. And or I can just work in the physical world and not have any emotional reaction to what I'm doing. So she says it's that the partnership that Rabbi Sacks is asking for, Karen Armstrong says, used to exist in the ancient world. It's a brilliant description. And I read it, I was like, yeah, that's how I look at it. For me, it's all one. It all overlaps. So yes, there might be two sides of the brain, but the whole point is you can't divide it. You can't live in one or the other. It's about the relationship between the two. Because otherwise you might have thought, and this is what Stephen Jay Gould, the biologist, argues, he talks about non-overlapping magisteria. That science is one thing, religion is the other. Don't confuse the two. But creation, so the Torah has a creation story. If the Torah just did ethical principles, fine, no overlap. But it's got a creation story, and scientists go, no, that's our story, right? We tell you how the world began with astronomy. So, but no, the Torah is telling it, but in a different, as you said, a different kind of way of what you need to know as a human being. What's your place in this earth? What's your place in this earth? What's your value? And it's funny because you always get confused what kind of question is being asked. So the classic one is like the little kid who says to his mummy, "Mummy, where do I come from?" And she's like, "Oh, here's the big conversation." She goes, "You have to understand when a mummy and daddy love each other very much." And she starts describing it. The boy's looking more and more uncomfortable. And he goes, "No, I'm just filling in for school. What's our address? Well, where do I come from? Where do we live? What's our address?" And the mums go, "Oh, I didn't realize that's what you're asking." So you have to understand, what is the question. When the Torah says, how did everything begin? It's asking from a mythos point of view. What is my place in this story? Which is why humans come at the end of the story. And then they get a role of what they're told to do. And they become the center of the story because the Torah has been written for them, right? It's not a science book in any kind of way, or a history book. I do make other interesting connections about science in it, but that's the basic principle. So for me, that's where I get it from. So I can recommend Karen Armstrong's The Case for God. If you've read it, it's a brilliant defense of religion. And she talks about lots of different sects in lot of different sects, sects, sects in Christianity. And you can relate to the Jewish ones, each one along. She goes, and then there were the Christians who did this, and you go, oh, that's the Hasidim, that's the this. So it's a great book, but that's my answer.
Yeah, I really hear that. And I think it really comes out in the book as well, how you're able to integrate, in some senses, your experiences, as you said, from the scientific perspective, how you see it also in a sense as this kind of this search for meaning really is also what is, the framework of meaning in our lives, and how do we mine.
And that's why I quote Einstein a lot, because Einstein, I've read there's a whole chapter about Einstein's search for God and what he understood by God and wonder. And he points out that there's a basic assumption in all of science that it's consistent, that it's going to work. And he says that's a faith. That's a faith underpinning all of science. And, it's one thing if a philosopher says that, but when the preeminent scientist, rationalist, who I love his work, it's amazing what he did, says that, then you realize that it underpins it. They understand that issue. So they're obviously interconnected. He's got this great line. I put it in a footnote, but I'll read it as we're there. It's a great line he says about the atheists, if I can find it quickly. I really liked what he said about that, because I want to know what did he think about atheism. As a man, he didn't believe in necessarily a personal, intimate God, but he did definitely believe in the idea of wonder and its place. And so on the atheist, he says, yes, he says, this is Einstein, he said, the fanatical atheists are like slaves who are still feeling the weight of their chains, which they have thrown off after their struggle. They are creatures who, in their grudge against traditional religion as the opium of the masses, cannot hear the music of the spheres. He's like, grow up. Brilliant.
So interestingly enough, you can, it's an amazing article by Howard Wetstein called the music of the spheres.
Okay.
Sherelle, I actually have as a PDF. I think I can send it to you. It's a phenomenal essay. Howard Wetstein's a very well-known philosopher in America, and he wonderful human being as well. I must say, I know him personally, and he wrote this beautiful essay exactly on that idea. And in his book, he has a book called The Significance of the Religious Experience. The whole book talks about the notion of awe. And that you're right, that's really what it was. And I'm going to actually skip our second question. I'm going to go to our third question because I want to leave enough time for questions from the audience as well. But actually this kind of segues beautifully into the last part of your book, where you speak about tefillah, you speak about prayer, and it's a really beautiful chapter, and I think it's a wonderful chapter because it kind of brings us in many ways. Firstly, that there's two reasons I think it's a beautiful way to close the book. You begin the book from a more kind of scientific, rational perspective. You're talking about creation, and you bring us to prayer. In a sense, what you do is you bring your own experience into the chapter, and you write so beautifully. And I'm actually just going to read where you outline why you pray. You get very personal and you outline why you pray, and you say, so consider the following questions. Sorry, I should probably ask you to read it, Rafi, actually.
What page is it? It's
page 303.
Yeah, I'll just do a bit of that. Yes. So consider the following questions. What do you really want in life? What are your most vital needs each day? If time was short and resources were limited, what do you think you could not live without? Responding to these questions for myself pushed me to consider what truly matters. The process became a worthwhile exercise in self-reflection. After some frank deliberation, I came up with 5 needs that I can't live without. 1, to make the most of being alive. 2, to learn and understand as much as possible. 3, to have health, happiness, and wisdom for the ones I love. D, to be helpful and kind. And E, to be connected to my people and build a meaningful relationship with God. And then I
Beautiful.
explain how,
Yeah.
instead of teaching prayer by asking what do I care about and then looking at prayer, I discovered that prayer answers my needs, and doing it that way around made it much more meaningful and personal to me.
So that I really, really love that. And there is a question I asked you, and I'm going to ask you here again. I personally identify very much with what you spoke about here. And I think in many ways what's happened today, the reason why, and I always think about this greatly, I think one of the reasons why prayer has diminished as a power for us is because psychology and psychologists have taken the place of prayer in many ways. Prayer used to be, when we had something heavy on our hearts or heavy in our minds, or we needed to process, people would turn to God. People would pray, and prayer was a way in which they kind of were allowed a process to happen within. And nowadays we have psychologists for that. That's not to denigrate psychologists. I believe they're very important, but I also think that we've lost, in a sense, that sense, exactly what we were talking about before, of awe, of transcendence. These ideas of being kind of putting ourselves in the world. Where is our place in the world? Is what prayer does for us, and in many ways that's where individualism and radical individualism has kind of speared its head, or become more central in our thinking, because we don't have that ability to kind of put ourselves into the place of the universe. But I do want to ask you, Rafi, it's quite an anthropocentric way of understanding prayer. As opposed to the classic, more traditional understanding in Judaism, which is in many ways far more theocentric. And I think, there would definitely be people who would argue very much against the way in which you frame it. Primarily someone like, for example, Yeshayahu Leibovitz, he would say that the way you frame it is that prayer is basically to serve our human needs, right? Rather than actually fulfilling a divine command, which is basically to pray three times a day with a minyan, etc., etc. There's many questions we can, many things we can say, but I'm gonna throw this out to you, that when I read it, though it spoke to me personally, I do feel as if there is, in a sense, the place of God doesn't hold much weight in that answer, in that response. And I wanted to challenge you on that.
No, I'm so glad you asked that. And it's so interesting because I was trying to think, because we talked about this, about how I was going to answer this. And I realized that actually something that I'd understood when I was writing it, and maybe it hasn't come across as clear as I wanted it. Because for me, it's all fundamentally about God. Because, the prayer forces us to face up to the reality of what we are and the nature of existence and the world that we live in, which is God's world. That's the point. So psychology, which is our awareness that actually by being thankful and by being appreciative, we can be more effective and successful. So in other words, the reason you pray is not to ask God to fix your life, but the act of asking fix your life. That's what you're saying. It's not about God, it's about your own psychology. The prayer is reflective. But that's not how I see it at all. I see it as being in touch with, and that's why I believe a modern educated person understands science. It's so interesting that, you say an educated person knows Shakespeare. But as far as I'm concerned, an educated person understands basic science and basic biology. And if they don't, they don't know what's really going on in the world around them. Prayer brings you back to a recognition of the nature of reality, which God made. This is the way the world is. What am I? When I prayed this morning in the long tachanun, there's a phrase, "Osa niflaot b'chol et," who does wonders all the time. Reality itself is magical. That's what Richard Dawkins wrote, actually, a book about the magic of reality. So let me explain to you what I mean. Just in creation, but each day there was confusion and then there was clarity, right? Each day it says, "Vayeh vayivokeh." There was confused things and God, there was evening and morning, and God made things more ordered. So we think, Tanya, that God is in miracles, in supernatural things that go away. But what's the whole point of creation? The greatness of God is order. As a scientist, I've understood that actually this world should be completely inconsistent, completely random, all over the place, and not fitting together. The fact that there is any kind of order in this world is the miracle of the existence, is God, is that thing. So I'm not saying God is nature, but I'm saying that the mind that created this order, this structure, which, you know, when you look into a microscope, when you see equations balancing, it's the most amazing thing to realize that all the way that it's always the same, that this is the nature of reality, is for me one of the deepest ways of relating to God. So being in touch with truth as it is, the way the world really is, how things work, how our minds work, is the closest we can get to God, as far as I'm concerned. So for me, it's suffused with God, but it's not the way God people talk. And for me, the way people talk about God, that I don't, not yours, you don't think of that, but people talk about God as this what I'm relating to as a person, as this physical thing. For me, that's idolatry. That's God, that's not what God is. So if you're worshiping that, then that's not prayer. Right? So you have to get away from all those things to find out what God really might be. And you might find out, you might not. But, you know, how many of us feel that even after being in a relationship with many years, or someone you've known for years, you turn and go, you don't really know me. Right? You don't really get me. When someone says to me, you don't really know me. You don't think God doesn't say that? You think we know God? You know, there's a great T-shirt of a friend of mine. He's a bit of a cynic. And it's a big T-shirt that says, God, please save me from those who follow you. Right? And he's afraid that we all think we box God. I know what God is. I'm a Christian priest. Christianity says it's this. I know what God is. Judaism is this. God breaks any rules of what you think it is. That's the whole point, that it's beyond that. So for me,
yeah.
so that's why I have to look at it in that kind of way. So for me, that's how I write. That's how I think. I couldn't get all of that in the book. It's too complicated, but that's how I look at it.
I said to you, when we had a conversation, I said to you, I feel that there's Heschel's footsteps in so many, or I should say Heschel's echoes in so many places in your book. And particularly now listening to you even more so, I think about how Heschel describes God as the ineffable. Rabbi Avraham Yoshua Heschel, he describes God as the ineffable. And that's exactly what you're saying, that when we place God into abstract categories, we lose something of the ineffability of a being that transcends every category of human cognition. And and prayer maybe is just tapping into that. And the way that we as humans know how to do that is through ourselves. We only have our own perspectives. So I understand why I understand why it feels quite anthropocentric, but I also understand what you're saying in the sense that in many ways, what you were trying to show is that actually by imagining God to be this kind of person in heaven, giving out good things and giving out punishments, and that is almost like Martin Buber says, childlike religion. And actually, in a sense, sometimes when we actually go deep into ourselves, we touch on that relationship which transcends every kind of category that we have as human beings. So that's really, really beautiful. And actually, I'm going to kind of wrap things up because I know we want to ask for some questions. I'm just going to take one other example where I saw such a beautiful interrelationship between kind of Dr. Zarum, the scientist, and Rabbi Zarum, the rabbi, where you speak about, it is in the chapter, what does it mean to believe in God? And you speak there about the idea of a physicist, someone called Rovelli, and you say, did I pronounce his name right?
Yeah, Carlos Rovelli, yeah.
Yeah. And you say Rovelli's insight is profound. You quote him, the relationships between elements of reality are more fundamental than the elements themselves. And so we see that on every level of existence, from physical matter to plant life to animal bodies and the human mind, everything is continuously interacting. And these interactions are so complex that notions of separateness and self are secondary to the primal reality of relationship. We could even say that all reality is best expressed as relationship itself. And I absolutely love that because in my mind, and I'm looking at it from the eyes of a philosopher rather than the eyes of a physicist, but in my mind, what you're doing is you're bringing dialogical philosophy. That's the philosophy of people like Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig and Emmanuel Levinas. That, in my mind, is such profound.
I know, totally, absolutely. But the great thing is with science is it's actually true. It's not just a metaphor.
And that's what I love.
When you look at the forces of nature, when you look at, you know, trees, you know, the mycelial network going thousands of miles, you know, it's a fallacy that we think that the world is still outside. Everything is moving and changing. We are naive as people. We've got lost in our minds and lost touch with reality, that it's interacting the whole time. and the way we've plugged
It's
it into
beautiful.
reality on everything.
It's
But
beautiful. And I love it. I
I
love it
learned it as a
because
scientist. Philosophers came to it through their realization, but to be able to see it in the real world, for me, is a huge level. So.
100%. And I think it really underpins so much of what this book has, which is your personal Yirat Shamayim, that your, or I don't translate Yirat Shamayim as fear of heaven. I actually translate it as awe of heaven,
Reverence
because
heaven,
this
yes.
sense of awe comes across in the book. And even that you speak a lot about faith and doubt. It reminds me of who I wrote my doctorate on, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who I know many of people here know, where he speaks about the difference between the skeptic and the believer is the frequency of faith and not the certitude of position. And I think you kind of hint at that. So I'm going to conclude and bring it together. I'd
Well, I'll
love to
tell you one
say
line I
more.
have to tell you, because when Rabbi Sachs was a university lecturer, I'm sure you know this one, Bernard Levin, and Levin said to Sachs when he was getting more religious, Sachs, you're a rabbi, you're religious. How can you be religious when you're such an intelligent man? How can that be? So Sachs's response was, Professor, think of me as a lapsed skeptic.
Yes, I remember that.
And that's how I see
Exactly.
myself.
And I think you bring that over in the book. In the book, you really do. You bring in this idea that doubt is okay. It doesn't make you a non-believer necessarily. It makes you someone that's kind of got that gap. And you've created in the book a relationship between the reader and the writer. And in many ways, I think what Rafi does brilliantly in this book is he brings his unique way of teaching actually into the book. And you feel it. You feel it. You can almost hear his voice when you're reading the book. And it's really, I recommend it to everybody. It's a beautiful book, a profound book, and also in many, many ways, very, very accessible, which is why I think it will work for a teenager as much as it will work for an elderly person who just wants a bit more insight into Judaism, and those who have a profound insight and want a deeper level. So I really recommend it to everybody. And I think, Shirel, should we take some questions?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to remove spotlight so people can choose how they're, and you can put it on speaker view so you can see Rabbi Zarum and myself. So I'll just say there are quite a few questions in the chat. Some of them are about the topics themselves, and I want to tell people, buy the book, read, and just for instance, and I'll say a few of the questions. So Rabbi Zarum, if you want to answer one of them, just tell me if any of them, or we'll send everyone to read the book. So a few came up about the relationship between prayer and meditation and yoga, and if based on what you say, they are interchangeable. A couple questions came up about the kind of documentary understanding of the Torah version and how that affects faith in God. I think those were mainly the questions about topics. And there was another question of if you touch evil or when bad things happens, if that is related to one of the questions that you ask in the book. So if any of those kind of you want to...
Yeah, no, I can respond to those. Interesting. Prayer, meditation, and yoga and different methods. I mean, prayer is the, first of all, Jews do all those things. They do meditation and they did physical exercise. All those things are described in the Talmud. We've become very staid in our prayers. Holding a book is such a shame to hold a book and not have prayers by heart. Knowing prayers by heart is not just useful when you're holding a child, which I discovered when I had young children, but actually it becomes part of who you are. So we've formalized it. We've been overly influenced by Christians and how we do our prayer processes. And, the rabbis say, people used to say the prayers as they got up in the morning, where they'd open their eyes, they'd say, and so on. And we stopped doing that to kind of be more formal in the synagogue. And the word siddur, for me, has become a straitjacket. It's become a control of what we do. And instead of seeing it, I want to publish a siddur, which was made of, because remember, what is prayer? It's hundreds of voices of our ancestors over thousands of years writing about how they relate to God. That's what it is. Different prayers have been tied together. So I'd love to have a kind of a siddur, which was not a siddur, which was like all different colors, all different sizes, wrapped together in elastic bands in a kind of mad way and say, this is what I want to say to God. And when I was in yeshiva, my rabbi encouraged me to write our own prayers as well, to get involved in those things. So what's going on in Israel today is very exciting. There's quite a few spiritual rabbis who are doing more meditation processes and doing yoga and doing informal ways of doing this. So absolutely, it's a huge, big subject. That's number one. In terms of documentary hypothesis, which I'm fascinated by the whole issue, that, yeah, I mean, It's my friend, Professor Joshua Berman. Rabbi Joshua Berman is an expert on these things. He's got this book, Ani Mamin, but his original book, Oxford University Press, really analyzes these things. And basically, the Torah looks like it's got different writers, different perspective, absolutely. But it also looks like other kinds of patterns as well at the same time. And the question is why? And how is it put together? And he shows very clearly that it's just as compelling to look at it as a chiastic structure as a multiple structures put together. It's, in other words, it's not consistent. And what fell through was that by making the assumption it's written by people, once you work from that assumption, then the documentary hypothesis shows you how it best would have been done. But it's not 100% compelling. And Josh Berman wrote the introduction to a book by Umberto Cassuto, who was a chief rabbi in Italy and then came to Israel, where he pulls apart the documentary hypothesis. This is like in the 50s as well, and shows the holes in it and parallels. The Torah clearly has multiple voices inside it, but that's because it's an advanced book. It's a postmodern book in that way. It's written in all different kinds of ways. And so I've never really had an issue with that kind of thing. In terms of the problem of evil, for me, why do bad things happen to good people? I've always felt the issue is why do bad people happen to good things? I think that's the problem with a lot of Jewish communities, to be honest with you. But in terms of the problem of evil, and Tanya and I debated this, what we didn't debate, and Tanya's a real expert on this kind of stuff, but the chapter about arguing with God is why I talk about that. But not only are we allowed to argue with God, but that's what God wants us to do, to be nudniks, to be ani neged. And our answer to evil is how we act in this world. And that's I talk about that. And I'm not sure if I did it justice, but there's a wild story where with Isaac convincing God of why he shouldn't destroy the Jewish people, which kind of makes a joke of either trying to understand evil or trying to understand these things. Like the question is, can a human being justify themselves to God? Right, the metaphor is like a character, and there was actually a postmodern novel written like this, Shirel, where I think in the 4th chapter the main protagonist meets the author at a bar, and the author tells the protagonist, I'm probably going to kill you off in the next chapter because I'm not enjoying writing you, and then the protagonist, the actor, has to convince the writer why he shouldn't kill him off, right? And it's difficult because he's an invention of the writer. So I think in that way sometimes that we're all in the mind of God. So can there be ever justifications ever? So that's not answers, but that's responses to those questions.
So we're going a little over time, but I do want to ask a couple more questions that came up. One is actually piggybacking on the answer you gave about the documentary hypothesis, because you quoted some of the people that came before you. So when approaching this book, you're obviously approaching also such an extensive literature that came before you. What was your mindset in terms of how do I tackle all of those questions and what am I bringing to the table?
Well, here's the key. There's no index. There's no index at the back, and there's no list of new books to read, or I could have done that for notes, but there is one index at the back, and it's an index of biblical references, not rabbinic, although I quote a lot of Talmud. The only reference at the back is the list of quotes from the Bible. Now, I do that partly because my father was a Yemenite Jew who knew the Bible by heart, but I do that because I believe that philosophy should come directly from Tanach. And I quote hundreds of verses to make the point. I think Rabbi Sachs, my teacher, actually began to do this as well in terms of being I see him in some ways as a kind of modern version of a Navi, of a prophet, of writing. So I go back to the original verses. So when I make arguments about that relationship issue me and Tanya were talking about, or the search for God, I show you in the verses of the Torah that's how the Torah writes it. That's what I've added. So I'd say each chapter, about 70% of it is presenting material that I've read, although putting it together in a different kind of way. And then I will always add my spin towards the end. And I kind of humbly, that's when I put, I would suggest, or I might speculate, or maybe. So I kind of add to the end of it, to add that. So that's how kind of the weight of the issue. But the choice of sources that I bring, both Jewish and non-Jewish, is specific to me, as Tanya has said. But I try and do it in a creative, original way and tell a story each chapter in a different kind of way. Rabbi Sachs taught me, he said, when you write a book, Rafi, he said, first book, make sure lots of references. So I did that. And he said, check your sources, be clear, and whatever you do, Rafi, don't be boring. That's what he said to me. He shook me, don't be boring. So I've tried to make it interesting in that way because it's a long journey and, it's late at night and people are busy and it's much more fun to check your phone and to watch Netflix. So I try and make it compelling enough that if you've got a good mug of coffee or cocoa, then you can keep going.
So two last questions. One, you mentioned your conversations with different rabbis and people from different denominations. I think you define yourself within the Orthodox or modern Orthodox denomination.
I'm trying to put the fun back to fundamentalist orthodoxy. And
do you feel that the book is speaking that voice, or is that it's allowing a different type of voice?
The last sentence of the opening introduction says, well, it says, I welcome your thoughts. It'd be good to talk. Contact me. And my sincere hope for this book is to be helpful to you and to anyone, religious or not, Jewish or not, who is questioning belief. And I went to a lecture by Gordon Brown, the Rabbi Sachs lecture last week, and a guy behind me tapped me on the shoulder and said, I'm reading your book. I'm not Jewish, I'm a Christian, but I want you to know it's meaningful for me too. So I've tried to write it as a modern person that relates, who's got questions about their faith. I am Orthodox, and so I teach it from an Orthodox perspective, but I hope that it's relevant to people of any kind of faith who are asking those questions from all different denominations.
Amazing. So you actually already answered also the other question by reading that part, which was about your ideal audience and the mindset of reading the book. So you're
I've said that, and I must mention, because I've got this. My favorite book. It scares me. Is by Dorothy Parker. It's a collection of quotes of her book reviews. Right, and she was acerbic about books. And when Tanya said that I've added something, I feel good, because one book she wrote was, "This book is a negative addition to the sum total of human knowledge." That was about my favorite book review she wrote was, "This book should not be tossed aside lightly. It should be thrown with great energy." So I hope my book doesn't fit into one of these critiques. But get hold of it, read it, see what you think, and I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Since people were asking, we will send a link with the recording and further reading materials, and mainly where to get this book. Dr. Tanya, thank you for leading us into the book in a way that really, I think, makes everyone want to read it. And also, I think, allowing us to peep into a conversation between a philosopher and a scientist mind, which I found quite interesting. I will say, Rabbi Zarum, there were a few questions here about when the audio version is coming out, and you do read beautifully. So I would advocate an audio version of this book too.
I'll have a go.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're also going to welcome Rabbi Zarum at I think on April 21st, on the day before Leil HaSeder, for a talk about Echad Mi Yodea, which I think is a promising way to enter Passover. So if you enjoyed this, please join us also for that program, and check out our website for many others. Thank you very, very much, and have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, wherever you are.
Thanks all. Thank you, Sherelle. Thank you. Thank you, Tanya, so much. Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye. Bye. Let's